Okay. Okay, so I wanted to start off with this quote that I came across. The type of reading material we first give to students sets their reading reflex, which I just love that reading reflex. Love that word there. The habit of using knowledge of letter sound relationships as the first strategy for reading unfamiliar words. Decodable readers that enable students to sound out rather than guess unknown words develops this reflex and lead to more successful independent reading. So with that, I just want to turn it over to Andrea and Stephanie. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thanks, Larissa. Thanks for that quote to open us up. Gosh, building that reading reflex, right? What does it take to help students automatically recognize those words that they read in text? That's a great way to start us off and anchor us today. My name's Andrea Setmeyer. I'm a school psychologist by training. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. I founded the Reading League Indiana chapter, and that's how I come into this space and into this work. And I'm delighted to be here with you today on this cold and kind of crummy Tuesday afternoon. I now have the honor of working for the Reading League National, supporting all of our state chapters. So it's just a thrill to be here with you today. And Stephanie, do you want to say hello?
Hi, my name is Stephanie Husseinovic. I am a kindergarten teacher in Decatur Township in Indianapolis. So I'm coming to you fresh off the 100th day of school. Um,
That's a
and
special day in kindergarten.
yes, it's very special and very tiring for us teachers. But I'm happy to be here and doing this with Andrea. I'm also on our school leadership team, and I get to help coach teachers on things about the science of reading. And I also serve on the Reading League Indiana's chapter. I'm a board member in the secretary role.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. You guys are going to love hearing from Stephanie and watching her in action in the classroom a little bit. So we hear a lot about decodable text, and we'll talk about decodable text a lot today. But what we really want to do is bring this lens of a case study, right? What does this actually look like in practice? How do you use decodable text in conjunction with and building on all the other things that you might do in your literacy block or in an intervention setting? And so that's what our focus is today. This article or this work and presentation really came from an article that I was invited to write as part of an IDA Perspectives magazine. This is an issue that was themed around practice, and that was such a brilliant idea by not me, but Stephanie Stoller and Nancy Everhart put together this whole issue on the idea of practice, right? Instead of thinking about an instructional routine around phonics, for example, and having a whole issue about phonics or one piece of that Scarborough's rope, they looked at all of reading through the lens of practice. And what can we take away from thinking about building skilled readers in terms of practice? And I just thought this was brilliant. One of the big takeaways for me is that attending to practice is a significant factor in closing that gap in achievement. Successful implementations of the science of reading in actual schools has included this careful attention to the amount and the type of practice that students receive in foundational reading skills. And not every student gets the same amount of practice, right? We know some students will need more than others. But looking at what happens when students struggle with reading and struggle to acquire those basic skills, what happens as they engage in less opportunities to read text, right? If it takes them longer and they're reading less quantity of text, what happens to their vocabulary development, to their reading comprehension? So this image that Dr. Stoller put together really shows that when reading is slow and effortful, there's this bottleneck, and it impacts all parts of their reading. It impacts their experience of reading. They find it less enjoyable. Their reading comprehension is lower. And so it was just a really great reminder about the importance of practice and paying attention to practice. That QR code will take you to the IDA Perspectives magazine website. I'm also putting a link in the chat. Would encourage you to check it out. The whole issue is just fantastic. The article that I wrote on decodable text is really anchored on this instructional hierarchy that may or may not be new to some of you. This is based on work from the 70s, where we're really thinking about what does it take to move a student through being a novice learner or being introduced to a new skill, all the way to being an expert at applying it and adapting it to different situations. So this instructional hierarchy can work for things like learning how to play tennis or a musical instrument, but today we're going to talk about it in light of foundational skill development. What does it take to move a student through this instructional hierarchy to become a skilled reader. So the first thing that you'll see here is the acquisition phase. In the acquisition phase, that's when we introduce a new skill. The skill is often laborious to perform, and students are highly inaccurate, right? You can think about this when you're holding up a picture of a letter and you're saying, what letter is this? And students are just taking wild guesses. They don't know yet. They've just been introduced to the concept of a letter and they're inaccurate and they need a lot of immediate feedback to become more accurate. That's the goal initially. Once they start developing some proficiency with that skill, they can perform it accurately, but often it still takes them a long time. Their rate is slow. They might have to stop and think about it. Maybe they're using the anchor of other letters that they know to find the name of that one. That's fluency, right? Then we want to build fluency so that they can automatically retrieve that information. But once they're fast, efficient, automatic, and accurate, our job is not done. And that is a really important takeaway, I think, from this instructional hierarchy, that even when we get to the point where a student sees the letter I and can associate it with the name I and the short sound I, our job is not done until they're able to generalize that sound within the context of a word and within the context of reading connected text. And that's where decodable text fits in, and we'll talk about that. Adaptation then would be being able to make judgments about multiple different sounds that a letter might make, right? The letter I doesn't always say I. Sometimes it makes other sounds and it behaves differently when combined with other letters. And so that's that adaptation piece of being able to apply those skills in different ways when needed, depending on the context of the word. Let me drop just a quick link to this instructional hierarchy infographic before we move on. Definitely something to check out. So decodable text, we hear a lot about decodable text. And when I'm talking about decodable text, I'm thinking of texts that are written for children that consist primarily of words that they can read correctly using the grapheme phoneme correspondences that they have already learned. So those letter sound combinations, whatever they have learned, they can apply it in the context of words. We're not going to ask them to read huge multisyllabic words that they don't know those letter sound patterns. We're going to put those letter sound patterns that they've learned into practice in that text, with the exception of a few unavoidable irregular words. So it's really difficult to write a text of any kind without using words like the or of. And so we're going to teach some of those words in isolation, but really focus on practicing skills that they've learned. If I walk into a school and I ask people to talk to me about decodable text, you hear a lot of crickets. It gets real quiet. But I did a quick search on Facebook, and if you look at the internet, sometimes folks are really outgoing in saying what they think or believe about decodable text. So here's some things that I found on social media. I've seen people say things like, I'm doing the science of reading because I'm doing decodable text. So decodable text does not equal doing the science of reading, right? The science of reading is this large body of research that describes all kinds of things in reading, reading development, why some students struggle, talks about assessment and systems and implementation. So just using decodable text is not equal doing the science of reading, but it could be a really good start depending on the characteristics of the students in front of you. I've also heard it said that decodable books are boring, that they sound terribly constricting in their language, or they have really strange vocabulary. That could be true depending on the decodable text that you're using. There are some times where we're trying to fit in words that follow our pattern that might not be the most common that we use in everyday language, but not all decodable books are boring. And honestly, we have more choices now than we ever have. And it's really an interesting time to be looking and in the market for decodable text. I've heard people say we don't have any research about using decodable text in the classroom, and that's also not entirely true. We could use more research. We could use some more studies that investigate scientifically what happens when you give good instruction and give students decodable text versus another kind of text for practice. That would be really interesting, and especially when are they ready to stop doing decodable text? We don't have a lot of research on when to stop and transition to other types of text. But we do have research, lots of research studies actually, that have used decodable text as part of their instructional routines and had really good outcomes for students. So it's not that there's no research. We could use more, but there's definitely some that we'll explore today that gives good evidence for using decodable text. I also want to clarify early on that different profiles of readers will benefit from differentiated instructional experiences. So we don't say all kindergartners need decodable text, right? It's going to depend on where they are in their sequence of learning and acquiring those foundational skills. And the last myth or misconception that I've heard about decodable text is, I love decodable text. Decodable text are magic beans. And this one makes me giggle. You know, decodable text can work wonders for some students, and I've seen that happen, but it's not magic beans. There has to be a match between the student's skills and what they're practicing in the text for decodable text to be an effective tool for practice. And that match is really critical for success. And so we'll give you some examples of how we match that today. All right. So we do have some studies that have looked at decodable text, and here are some of the benefits that we've seen. The first one is that we know that to solidify those new letter sound correspondences, those phoneme grapheme correspondences, students need frequent opportunities to respond, right? It's not enough to show them A says ah and have that do that once and then they've got it moving forward. They need lots and lots of repetitions. Decodable text offers tons of repetitions, right? A carefully planned decodable text can give students 40 or 50 at-bats with practicing that specific sound symbol correspondence. The second benefit that we see from research is that it facilitates orthographic mapping, right? We know that when we carefully attend to the sequence of letters, when we're sounding out and matching the pronunciation of word with the spelling and the meaning, that facilitates orthographic mapping, which is the process that students can eventually read words automatically by sight. So looking at that context in a word, not just on a flashcard, not just the letter in isolation, but looking at it within the context of a word, or facilitates that orthographic mapping. That's our goal for every student. And then finally, this is what Larissa talked about at the beginning. There's a study in 1985 that compared looking at decodable text in predictable or leveled readers. And what they found is that students who had decodable text, who were able to be successful in applying their phonics knowledge and sounding it out, had a better habit of attending to those letters of the word as the primary means of recognizing the word. So after the study was over and they gave them different text, they didn't rely on picture clues. They didn't rely on first sound guesses. They relied on the letters in the word as that primary means of recognizing the word. So it builds the habit of skilled readers, especially with very young and very new readers. There are some drawbacks to consider in using decodable text. This is from Castles, Rassel, and Nation et al. In 2018, and they shared this potential drawbacks. So one is that once students have a core set of letter-sound correspondences, they actually don't get any more opportunities to practice those in decodable text than in other books, right? Once you've mastered a lot of those basic grapheme phoneme connections, I'm still going to see those same letter patterns in uncontrolled, authentic children's literature that I would in decodable text. So it's really important early on when you only have a few letters and sounds to work with. But as you acquire more, any text gives you that type of practice, and that's a really good consideration. The second one is that there are some restrictions in word choice, and so decodable text may tend to be inferior to other texts in sustaining interest and motivation. And so that could be a factor that you're thinking about with your students. If you're having a really hard time with a specific decodable text, you might think about, how are we building knowledge? How are we sustaining interest, and bring in some other types of books for practice. The third piece is really thinking about the simple view of reading, or Scarborough's rope. And we know that this is really good practice for building word recognition skills, but decodable text may not be the best choice for building language comprehension skills. We may need to find other text if our focus is vocabulary, building knowledge, and really introducing students to those complex language structures that are in written text. So some potential drawbacks to consider, and how you might plan using text in different times of your day. All right, but let's get back to decodable text and think about how we're going to use this type of practice to benefit students learning to read. When I think about learning a new phoneme grapheme correspondence, so I'm introducing a brand new letter sound combination for the first time. We're going to start at acquisition, that yellow box. We're going to explicitly model and teach that phoneme in isolation. I want to make sure students can pronounce it correctly, that their mouth, that manner and placement of articulation are accurate. We're going to blend and segment it orally in the context of words. I want to make sure that they know where that sound is in words that they're familiar with. That's that acquisition phase. So it's going to be slow and laborious, and we're focusing on accuracy. Once I know that they can hear it, that they can say it, we're going to show them what it looks like. We're going to map that phoneme onto the grapheme, usually with visual and auditory drills, right? We explicitly teach that letter formation and we practice, this is the letter, this is the sound that it makes, the most common sound, and we make sure that those are associated with each other through visual and auditory drills. That's beginning to move us into fluency, right? As students become more accurate and automatic with that recognition. But that's not enough. We need to start that fluency process in the context of real words. So both decoding and encoding in the context of words is where we go next in our hierarchy. After words, then we need to move to sentence level, phrases and sentences, and scaffold and support students being able to decode and encode those words and sentences. And then finally, in decodable text would be how we generalize. Here's that letter sound correspondence, and we walked you all the way through to decodable text. Now, after that generalization, I don't have it on this graphic, but after generalization, again, would be adaptation, where we take that skill and we're able to apply it in different contexts in authentic children's literature. So I might be able to apply the multiple sounds that I makes in different contexts. Here's an example from a UFly Foundations manual that really walks through that instructional sequence, right? You can see that here, the sound that they're introducing is sh, represented by the grapheme SH. We're going to practice previously learned skills. We're going to hear what that SH sound sounds like auditorily while blending and segmenting words. We're going to be really careful about how we introduce that sound. Make sure you have a text for how to move your mouth and lips to make this. And then we're going to show them what it looks like. We're going to practice forming those letters. We're going to read real words, spell real words, move on to word chaining, then connected text and sentences. And a lot of the work time here you'll see is devoted to that decodable text. And so practicing it within that context is really supportive for students to master those skills. All right, so Dr. Lane shows us in lesson 8, the short I sound is introduced in lesson 8. After it's explicitly modeled, corrective feedback is given, and then you have 41 opportunities to practice it in lesson 8, which is usually over 2 days. 41 is a lot. That's a pretty good number of at-bats, especially when you think about lessons and other programs you might be familiar with. But here's the cool part about the cycle of UFly Foundations Manual and continually practicing this skill is that when you go on to lesson 9, there are 59 opportunities to practice that short I sound in context. In lesson 10, there are 64. So if you count out the total number of opportunities to respond in the 10 lessons that follow introducing it, there are 338 opportunities to respond spread out in a variety of words and context in about 20 instructional days. Almost all of them are in real words, real sentences, in decodable text. That's the kind of intentional practice we're talking about that leads to mastery. All right, so some key takeaways on decodable text before we move into these case studies. The first one is that any particular text is decodable to the student in front of me only if there's a strong match between those phoneme-grapheme correspondences in the text and what the reader has learned. So even though a text might say it's 80% decodable, 90% decodable, that only matters if the student has already practiced and acquired those sound letter combinations. The second thing I hope you see here is that reading decodable text is not an add-on or an isolated activity from the rest of your lesson. Really, I want you to think of it as the culmination of a continuum of practice opportunities with those newly acquired decoding skills. And then finally, decodable text offers that really rich practice environment for cultivating the habit of proficient readers, right? It helps us break habits about looking at picture cues or first letter guesses, because students can be successful applying those phonics skills to the words on the page. All right, anything in the chat, Stephanie, we should look at before we move on?
There was one question from Heidi about guidance on when to move from decodable text to level text, and are there habits or descriptors that indicate we should move on?
Great question, Heidi. That's the question that I've been asking myself as well. I have not seen an actual research study on that question. I've seen some advice from different folks in the field who have worked with students for a long time. And the best answer I can give is when they're successful with it. That's going to be hard to judge unless at some point you notice some skills and then give them one to try and see if they're successful. If you see a student starting to rely on picture cues or really stumbling through those words, that would be a sign to me that they may not be ready, and I'd stick with that decodable text. I also think that you'll hear in Stephanie's presentation that there will be places and times where you can weave that in while you still keep decodable text for practicing the new skill you've learned. And then you still might use some leveled text or other things for different parts of your day. It's a great question. Hopefully we'll get some more research on that soon. All right, let's dive in then and see what this looks like in a real live kindergarten classroom.
All right, so I have been teaching kindergarten for 13 years. And for many of those years, I taught guided reading small groups using leveled text. So I would have picked that leveled text that you see there at the top pretty early on in the kindergarten year. I would have picked that because it had our new sight word look in it. I would have called kids over. We would have done a picture walk. I would have read a couple of pages and then they would have read the rest. And they're reading, voila. But not really. So then I started learning about the science of reading and learning about decodable text. And one of the first shifts I decided to make in my classroom was to use decodable text for that practice time and for decoding. So it wasn't the easiest transition to make. I had some groups that read it just fine, and then I had other groups that just couldn't seem to read the words. And I didn't have my tricks to fall back on anymore. I couldn't say, look at the picture, and I couldn't say, get your mouth ready with the first sound. Those were not options anymore with the decodable text. So I stuck with it, and I just knew that I had some skills that I had to address with students to get them to be able to lift the words off the page. So now I used decodable passages like you see on the bottom right, because that one aligns with my phonics scope and sequence, and it gives them the opportunity to apply and practice what we're learning in phonics. But like Andrea mentioned earlier, there's not one type of text that's going to be perfect for all the skills that you need to cover for students to become skilled readers. But now when I make decisions about text, I just think about what skills I'm addressing and then what type of text best supports that goal. So if I am working on word recognition, I'm going to use a decodable text that aligns with my phonics scope and sequence. If my goal is vocabulary and to build oral language, then I am going to bring in read alouds with rich language and find ways for my students to interact and discuss the text. If the purpose is for them to do partner reading or independent practice, or I'm sending home reading for kids to do, it's going to be a reread of a decodable that they've had time to practice both in whole group and small group. If the goal is for knowledge, I probably wouldn't use any of those texts that you see on the page. I would bring in a variety of different read alouds and texts, or even assign kids books that relate to the knowledge topics that we're learning about.
And there's a question in the chat about working with students who are learning English as a second language. It's a great connection, Michelle. Should they be instructed with decodable text? Yes, if the purpose of using that decodable text is to practice a new letter sound correspondence that they're working on. Should they be immersed in leveled text due to rich vocabulary and language? It depends on the level text. Levels A, B, C are not that rich sometimes in vocabulary and complex language structures, right? So I agree with your thinking, and we want to make sure we're giving students access to rich vocabulary and language structures and finding really good books that do that. Also knowing that when we use a decodable text, like I'm looking at the pin in the map, that we might have to take some time and explain some of those words to our students who are unfamiliar with the English language and show them what a tin is and where we keep pins in tins. That could be really supportive to help them make meaning from even those decodable texts.
So there are many things that I do to prepare students for reading a decodable text that align with that continuum that Andrea shared a few slides back. So I'm going to explicitly teach the letters and sounds, and then we're going to have lots of opportunities to practice that target sound at the word and sentence level. I know the passages are going to have high frequency words in them, so we're going to spend some time reading and writing the irregular words and drawing attention to that irregular part of the word. So we're going to spend a lot of time reading at the sound, word, and sentence level, and then moving into the passage. So I'd like to show you just a small part of that process. This video is a we-do of reading our new target sound at the sentence level. So I had introduced the S ending and how that can change the meaning of a word. And we've had a lot of practice reading at the word level and writing at the word level. So this is us practicing reading at the sentence level. So as you're watching, I'd like you to just listen to what I'm doing, what the students are doing, and what type of feedback I'm able to give kids during this choral read. Let's do the next one. Please look for heart words first. What heart words do you see? And the again. All right, do we see any S endings? Yes. I'm hearing somebody say two. Is there two? There's one. There are two S's, but this is the only S ending. So we'll read that base word and then with an S. This one's at the beginning, so we'll just read that like we usually do. Eyes on the board, and everyone start with that heart word. With an S, it's reread. I'm hearing sit, but I see at. Let's try that again. Reread. The I hear pit, but I see ed. Let's try it again. Pen. Now let's reread the whole thing. Everyone's looking and everyone reads. Not pin, it's et. Pen. The pup sat in the pen. All right, great job. We're going to read one more sentence, okay? All right, what heart words do you see? And the. All right, do we see any of our S endings? How many? One. So we'll make sure we read that base word and then go all the way through to that S. All right, let's get our mouths ready with this first sound. Now we're having a little trouble with vowels, so I want you to pay attention to the vowel and make sure you're getting the correct one. So I see I, so let's put S and I together. Go. Sid. What word? Reread. Wonderful. Sid and Meg see the cat. Do they see one cat? No. They see more than one cat because we have that S ending. Great job, everybody. We're going to write some sentences. So please go get your phonics notebook and pencil.
I love how adamant they are. No, not just one cat, Miss Vic.
And they know that without even having a picture of cats on the page.
That's right.
So after watching that, one thing that I thought about was they were struggling with that vowel. So that would have been a good time to go over to the sound wall and show them that difference with their mouth placement and practice that letter sound correspondence. So after that video, then we would move on to reading our connected text passage. So I would read that, they would go to their seats and do a choral read. And I can give quite a bit of feedback with a choral read, but they're still not quite enough to make all of those corrections. So it's definitely important to listen to kids reading in a small group setting. So I always make that a priority with my small groups. I might have groups working on different skills, but we're always going to bring in that connected text piece. when I am listening to kids read, I want to be as specific as possible with my feedback when they're reading words correctly and when they're making errors. So the first video is a group that is working on reading the target sound at the word level. So they have a word list, and we're working on going all the way through the word to build that fluency. So I'm just going to show that part of that group. They still read their connected text passage after that, but we're going to watch the word list part first. I'm going to read this first two, and then I see an M, so I know I'm going to start with a whiny A. So, tam, and then I'll drag it quick and say it a little, even more quickly. Tam. Tam is the character in our passage today. Watch me do the next one. So I'm going to start my mouth closed with and I'm going to quickly put it with Watch. Meg. Meg is our other character in our passage. Let's do the next one together. So we're going to start our voice with G and go right into ah. Ready? Go. Got. What word? Got. Okay, let's do the next one. Cat. Oh, with an S, it's cats. Good. Do the next one. Keep going. Good. You are reading that very smooth. All right, I hear you stopping. B, let's try to put B and together and hold it out. There we go. Bed. That was smooth. Good. You went right through that word without stopping your voice. Yeah, it's a little hard with stop sounds at the beginning, right? But if you put it with your vowel, then you can drag it. So you would say caught, because you can hold that ah out, right? Try that again. That's another stop. So put your first sound with your vowel and hold it out. Pet. Awesome. Good job getting that S on the end. Can you read that next one for me? Good. You went all the way through pet, but what could you do to add that S? Pets with an S. Okay, so just some of those prompts were drawing attention to stop sounds and how they can hold out their vowels, encouraging them to read the base word first and then adding that S ending. So like I mentioned before, they're reading this at the word level, and then those same words are going to be in their connected text passage that they'll read next. So then the next group that you'll see is the reading of the passage. So they did not have to do at the word level. They're getting right into reading that passage. So that can kind of show you how your groups might be reading the same passage, but the level of support and how they're getting there can be a little bit different. Oh, you said says, but what heart word is that? With an S, it's? There you go. Pay attention to the letters. Good. I like how you sounded out the base word. I like how you sounded out the base word and then said it again with the S. That was great. Good job going all the way through that word without stopping your voice. What vowel do you see? Try sounding out the base word first. Right here. Oh, which one are you on? Which word? This one? Okay, sound out the base word. What word is that? Sit. With an S. Yeah, so you Good job getting that S. So again, some of the same prompting, drawing attention to the letters, telling them, I heard you say this, but I see this letter. What sound? And then encouraging reading that base word and adding the S ending. I'm going to read this first two and then. So not every group is going to look like those two. I have one group that needs a lot more practice with saying the first sound and connecting it with that vowel to hold out and blend easier. I also have a group that would come over and read that text pretty quickly. And in that case, I could add in some of that uncontrolled text if they're ready for it. So I still have them read the passage just to make sure that we're accurate with that sound pattern. And then those other texts that I choose might be based on interests or the knowledge topics that we're reading about. So I just want to share a little bit of data with you and how I made the decisions of what to work on in the groups with those students. So this is my real life data from the end of Q2. I have 20 students in my class, which is pretty low for what I usually have, but the data that you'll see reflects the 17 students that were here from the beginning to the end of Q2. So I had some move in and some move out. So the first two pieces I want to look at are letters and sounds. So they're doing a great job with letters and sounds. This is the data is showing all of the sounds. Even though we haven't covered all of them explicitly in our scope and sequence, I have some students that already know them all. So that's not going to be a big focus in my small group instruction. We're still doing it whole group with visual and auditory drills to maintain that automaticity. But we don't need to spend time on that in our small group. And then Andrea, if you could go forward a little bit more to the Acadians results. So this is the last column is phoneme segmentation fluency, and they're looking really good with that too at the end of Q2. But when I gave this assessment, they're really quick at segmenting 3 sounds, but almost none of them were able to segment 4 sounds, or especially if they were blends. So I know that that's still going to need to be a focus that I work on in my small groups, especially since we're working on reading words with 4 phonemes now. And then the next one is the spelling dictation assessment that was at the end of that week of the videos that you saw. So their reading was coming along really well. They sounded great, but we have a lot of work to do with spelling. So that's what this is showing with the new concept that we learned. We just started adding 4 phonemes in. So we have more practice that we need to do for that. So that kind of guides what I'm going to do the following week to follow up with students.
Thanks, Stephanie. And when did you take those videos? Is that like the end of kindergarten, beginning, recent? Tell us when that was.
They were last week. So actually it was the week coming right when we came back from break. So 2 weeks ago now.
Isn't that remarkable, you guys? In Decatur Township, where I worked for a long time, is probably similar to a lot of your districts in that we don't have a lot of students that attend preschool prior to coming to kindergarten. And if you looked at Stephanie's data, she had about half of the students there at risk for reading difficulties, either because they were learning English as another language or they had been identified as having an IEP. And still with that explicit systematic instruction and really intentional practice, those are just really incredible outcomes to see already in January. So kudos, that's exciting. All right, so that's one case study of how you might think about decodable text in a classroom setting with beginning readers, right? And that could look like kindergarten for you. It might look like first grade in your context. But really, when we think about a beginning reader, anybody working on those skills would benefit from that type of practice. And so that's where intervention comes in. If you have a second, third, fourth, fifth grader even that has similar skills, decodable text can be a really good opportunity for practice. So I'm going to introduce you to a student that I get to have the pleasure of working with. She lives right down the street from me, and she's a good friend of my daughter's. This is Edie. She is homeschooled, and she's the second in her family, so her mom had already taught somebody to read. And when she was teaching Edie, she said, gosh, this is really different. And so we're chatting and talking, and she said things like, it's just not sticking. We teach a letter and a sound one day and it seems like she knows it. And then the next day it's not there. She wakes up and it's like starting over again. She had switched pretty recently at this conversation at the end of first grade to an OG-based curriculum. So something a little bit more systematic and explicit. She'd already made that transition. In talking, there was a family history of dyslexia. Edie presented with just a very bright verbal student. She was joyful. She had no history of language delays. She was easy to converse with and talk with and had a great vocabulary. So like any good school psychologist, I started pulling out every test I could think of, right? And I wanted to get a good picture of where her skills were and what we might think about doing. So this is over the summer, but I compared her to that end of year first grade benchmark points using the core assessment. And I kind of color coded here red, yellow, and green. So right away, you can start to see a little bit of a pattern, right? Green, vocabulary, strong. That's a strength of hers, is her knowledge about words and language. There's a lot of red, though, in terms of her phonics skills, that phoneme deletion, a little bit mix in that phonological segmentation, and then being able to identify high frequency words was also a struggle for Edie. I administered some curriculum-based measures, and the thing that stuck out at me when I had her read a passage out loud, you can see my little note, every word sounded choppy, right? Almost every word she's attacking as decoding, right? So play is p, l, a, ya. And she's not making the jump from those sounds to play, is she? Every single one. She's saying liked is k, d. Licked, she would sound it out as licked, and she would do it again. So how is her comprehension of these passages? Pretty poor, right? Because she knows that you don't lick to play, right? She knows that the word should be liked, but she's not able to even focus her attention on that comprehension because everything is so effortful in sounding it out, sound by sound. The image on the right hand of the screen is her letter sound fluency. And look at that, no errors, 100% correct. This is a huge strength of hers. She can look at those individual letters in isolation and match that sound pretty fluently. So on a few curriculum-based measures, her profile looked like this. Here's some green we're celebrating, right? Letter sound fluency, awesome. Phonemic segmentation fluency. She knows when she looks at a word, she's gonna sound it, chop it up, and do sound by sound and work her way through it. Awesome. Letter naming was a little bit of a risk factor, risk indicator. Nonsense word fluency was pretty slow and laborious, 93% accuracy. But then look at her try to put it together in connected text. That's where the huge breakdown was happening. 9 words per minute on that oral reading fluency with only 39% accuracy. So where are you going to start with intervention, right? Comprehension? Her comprehension was not good. I can see how somebody would think that that might be the target. But it's really clear when you think about some of these signs of reading anchors that the issue is not with comprehension, but with some of those underlying foundational skills. So let's think through a simple view of reading really quickly. Just drop in the chat. Are you more worried about word reading or language comprehension with Edie? Word reading, right. This is a pretty clear-cut case, and it could be both for some students. With Edie, I had pretty good data to say we're really looking at those initial word recognition skills. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So in Scarborough's rope, if you think about those word recognition strands, where am I really focusing? Yep. That ability to instantly recognize words. She was pretty good at decoding in some aspects of the way decoding, right? Like she knew to sound out those letters. She had pretty good letter sound mastery, but she wasn't looking and reading any word by sight. I really wanted her to have that automatic sight recognition and the blending skills. Yes, Melody, that phonemic awareness was strong and segmenting was really weak in blending. Yep. All right, what if you think about it through the lens of that instructional hierarchy that we looked at earlier? When you think about acquisition, moving into fluency, moving into generalization of that skill, where is she? I see her as all over the place, right? So students can be at different points in this hierarchy with different skills. So with letter sounds, she was pretty accurate and automatic. I would say she was ready to start working on generalizing when it comes to individual letter sounds. But with word reading, she was just starting to be accurate, and we're really thinking about fluency, looking at those individual words. And with 9 words per minute on that oral reading fluency, I'm really thinking of her as a beginner in acquiring the skill of reading connected text. We're in that early acquisition phase where we know it's going to be a struggle, laborious, and we want to help build success and accuracy. So with that in mind, I started thinking about decodable text because it could offer a rich practice opportunity for all 3 of those skills, right? She's going to generalize letter sounds. She's going to build fluency with words, and we're going to start scaffolding that experience to be able to read connected text. So our plan, really briefly, I shared results with Mom. The first thing I said to her is, good job. Good job. Look at how quickly and accurately she knows those letter sounds, because I knew how many months of practice that had taken. So we could celebrate that and move on and work on applying them in the context of a word. We decided that she was going to continue her current curriculum. She'd already switched to an OG-based curriculum at the pace of mastery. So not too fast. This was really a blessing that she was being homeschooled at the time because she could go at her own pace of mastery. I was going to add in 1 30-minute one-on-one intervention session a week, really focusing in on that building fluency at the word level with CVC and consonant blends, using mostly short vowels in decodable text. If you're thinking that sounds really specific, Andrea, why are you focusing on decodable text with those sounds? That's from her data, right? So I wanted to find some skills that she was mostly successful at, that she already had some accuracy and even a little bit of fluency. I would have loved to see a little bit of green when I'm working on this, but we worked with what we had, right? We're going to start with those short vowels and CVC because she knew 13 out of 15 of them. And we're going to work on those consonant blends with short vowels. That's where I'm going to start with my decodable text, not with the letter sounds that she's working on with Mom in her lesson. We're going to go back to some concepts that she's a little bit more confident in and more successful with to practice that. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. To practice adapting and using those sounds in the context of words and text. All right, initially we thought we were going to send home decodable text for rereading and fluency practice. Rereading can be a nice way to help build that fluency, but that didn't last very long. Within about the first week or 2, she was really bored with rereading those decodable texts. And so what we switched to at home was reading books that she was more interested in, that she'd already read with Mom and already had received some corrective feedback and knew that she could read pretty accurately as she read it often to her little brothers and sisters. And then I was going to progress monitor monthly with oral reading fluency, and then I was going to use weekly skill data as my check. I have a note up here that context is key. This plan might look different if it was in a school setting, right? You might be thinking about small group, and you might be grouping students together based on data and needs. I might monitor more frequently with oral reading fluency if I was giving more frequent sessions. But because I was only doing 30 minutes a week, right, I was monitoring about every 2 hours. I was going to check in of intervention time. All right, in terms of what I did for intervention, I'm not going to share that exact routine, but I have linked here some of the routines that I used. They're from a really awesome study by Bruce McCandless et al. In 2003, the word building intervention. It's from a teaching tutorial that's on the Reading Links website. And then about a few months in, I switched and used the UFly Foundations manual, and that became where I grabbed the decodable text and the instructional routines from, because she had it all laid out beautifully. At least half of each lesson, I was really committed to spend reading connected, mostly decodable text. All right, so let's check in. So again, this is about 6 months in, and you can see that graph. Every time we read an oral reading fluency passage, we graphed the number of words that she was able to read correctly. And so here she is at about 40 words correctly. This is almost 6 months in, friends.
Once upon a time, people wore hats all the time. We wear hats now, but in the past they wore hats a lot.
Okay, what do you notice? And I wish I had a video of her at the beginning. You're going to have to take my my poor examples as that choppy sound by sound patterns. But how does she sound now? What are you noticing? she's reading whole words pretty accurately, right? That's huge. So that's what 40 words sounds like. And that was a significant bump up. It took us a long time to get to, but wow, was it a celebration. Are we done? No, right? We've got some phrasing to do. We want to see some more connecting those words into phrases and sentences, but no more licked. That's right. She's able to look at those words and automatically read them by sight. And I want to just specify again, it's not just because we use decodable text. It's because we would look at those patterns first on their own, then in words, bring it into the decodable text and reread that decodable text several times so that she had a chance to orthographically map, pay attention enough times that those became automatic for her.
Once upon.
All right, so I already told you at about that 40-word mark is when I switched to UFly Foundations. I've modified the plan. Edie didn't need every single piece of those steps, right? She already had mastered some of those skills in isolation because we were working back a few paces from where her current instruction was. So what I did was use that phonemic awareness piece as a warm-up to help her hear that sound in the context of words. We did a lot of blending drills, a lot of blending drills. I did abbreviated new concept overview, just enough to help her focus in on what the new skill was for the day. Did a lot of word work, reading, spelling, individual words and sentences, a lot of word mapping, word chaining, and then reading those lists multiple times, again, to build in as many practices and opportunities to respond as I could. And then we put that all into a connected text with a decodable passage that we usually read 3 times. And here she is when she reached her goal. So she knew right away when we started that our goal was to max out that page. And so that's about 84 words per minute that she was able to do. And look at that smile. All right, let's check back in. So how we are doing things now, I still meet with Edie once a week. And now my UFly lesson matches pretty close to where mom is in her scope and sequence. So we're working on the same skill in tandem. One of the biggest things you'll notice is that I can now give her that decodable text of that uses a new skill that same day, right? I don't have to, when she was starting, it was so hard for her to put that into fluent reading that we were going back to earlier, really well-mastered skills. Now she has an idea of how to read fluently. She has a lot of those words already orthographically mapped. And so she has a little bit more energy to apply a new skill in the context of text. This is a new skill for her. This is the sound. So using IR and UR to make that sound. And so you'll hear her struggle a little bit, but I think you'll also notice some improvement.
Yep, Irma.
Irma the turtle loved to surf.
Good.
Surf. Her mother's Shirley was the first girl surfer in the turtle village, and Irma wanted to be just like her. Every morning, Irma.
So some things I'm noticing here, right? Much better phrasing. You're hearing her start to put a couple of words together. She's also self-correcting when she hears herself make a mistake. She's starting to pay attention and do that. You saw some errors like adding an S to the end of a word, right? She knows that word said mother, but she jumped right and added mothers, or she'll leave out little words. And so this is my version of progress monitoring every time I'm reading with her, is I'm just taking notes of the types of errors that I'm seeing and making sure that we're attending to them when we reread that passage. This was her cold read, but when I go back and do it a second time, I'll make sure to stop and have her correct it and then reread as a phrase, just like you saw Stephanie do with the classroom. All right, friends, this is why we do the work, right? When I think about Edie in a school setting, if I was a school psychologist and she was in the beginning of 2nd grade classroom and the teacher referred her to me, and looking at her data, I don't know that she would have been picked up right away. If she'd been using leveled readers and guided reading, she was a really smart girl and she had really strong compensating skills. And she might have gone undetected and unnoticed for a long time. But she had those significant word reading difficulties, and by matching that intervention, giving her lots of opportunities to practice in the decodable text, we were able to beef up those word recognition skills so that she can read almost at grade level. She's doing a beautiful job. She still needs more repetitions to master a skill. She still needs more intense instruction than other students might because of her risk and characteristics of dyslexia. But she's successful, and this is a celebration, a good story. All right, that is what we have for you today. I just wanted to put a little plug in for the Reading League chapters. We are 33 chapters strong now across the country, doing all kinds of work like this in 33 states. So I've got a link there, and I'm also going to put in the chat a link to the Reading League's decodable text sources. If you're interested in finding some new decodable text to use with your students, you can check out some of these. We try to keep an up-to-date list of the many, many, many sources that are available to you now so that you can match it to the scope and sequence you're working with and use it for practice with your students. And we'll share this link one more time to the slide deck so that you can have access to all of the references and links that should be live in that PDF.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Stephanie. That was fantastic. I added a feedback form in the chat as well. If people would like to fill that out, that gives me great information about what topics people are interested in next. So that's in there. But I wanted to make sure there weren't any other questions. And it is something that really stood out to me, Stephanie, while you were teaching in your small group, which I love to see this, is that the students were working harder than you. And I think that's something that I learned, not early on in my career. I think maybe 8 to 10 years in. Alicia Sparks, for those of you who know her, was coaching me, and she stopped me after the lesson and said, "You are working harder than the student." And that was me not bringing the reader prepared to that lesson for that text. And so that was such a good lesson for me to learn, that our students need to be the ones working harder than us to do the decoding, to do that heavy lifting of lifting those words off the page. And I saw your students really getting to experience that powerful practice when they came prepared, and you had done a really nice job of matching them to the text and to what they were ready to tackle with that text, whether it was words or connected text. So I just wanted to just say that was such a joy to see them working and you guiding them. Like, you're there to facilitate and give that feedback and that praise, and just really help them with corrections when needed. But yeah, it was just a joy to see you teaching in that way.
Thanks, Larissa. That's a really good point that you make about not working, having them doing a lot of the work and the heavy lifting.
Yeah. Stephanie, somebody wants to know, are you using a certain curriculum or phonics scope and sequence in kindergarten where you're at?
Yes. So my school switched in October to UFly as our phonics scope and sequence. So we're using that for the word recognition, and we still have our reading series, and we're using that more for our language comprehension.
Yeah, great. If people aren't familiar with the UFly site, I think somebody linked it, right? Was that one of you guys that linked that in there? Yeah, that toolbox is fantastic. Even if your school is not using a specific scope and sequence, that's available in that toolbox with corresponding materials, teaching slides, and practice for students. But I've also found it's a really great resource if you are maybe teaching with another phonics scope and sequence and you're looking for additional practice opportunities. There's the roll and records, there are decodable text. Again, just making sure it's a good match for your students, right? They're coming to your group with the skills they need to be able to tackle that text. But I think if you're just looking at that text with that careful lens, it's a great tool to use to add in extra practice for our kids who need it.
One thing I did want to say is that continuum that Andrea shared would be really helpful if you don't have UFly. Following a scope and sequence that you do have access to, and using that continuum to teach the sounds, practice that target sound at the word level, and at the sentence level, and then the passage. So I was doing a lot of these things without having UFly. It makes it a little bit easier because they put in that interleave practice where I had to do a lot of that work myself with my other scope and sequence. So it can be done. It's just a little more work on the teacher to plan that out.
Mm. Yeah. Um, Anything else? If teachers don't have access to UFly lessons, which lesson frameworks would you suggest for classroom teachers?
Yeah, so this is a little bit tricky. I don't know, Larissa, if you want to answer. At the Reading League, we're not endorsing a specific curriculum or a specific program, but really thinking about your knowledge of those skills and those instructional routines to apply it in the classroom. So in the on the intervention page, I had some links to a couple of places that have like a 5-step lesson plan of how to introduce and follow through that instructional hierarchy, a new skill all the way to mastery. You could use that. There are a few kind of freely available phonics scope and sequence and lessons out there that you can use. Larissa, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that one.
Have you guys checked out Reading Universe? I think there's some really nice materials there for teachers to lean on and pull from. Reading Universe, I think it's .org. And then it just slipped my mind. Well, Florida Center for Reading Research is always one of my favorite resources and go-to places. West Virginia Phonics, I know a lot of people, if you're looking, you need something like maybe your district doesn't have a core program in place and you're looking for something. I know that teachers have leaned heavily on that before.
I also just want to send another shout out to Stephanie. She started doing some of this work, swapping out decodable text and implementing some of these instructional routines before the district had really adopted a curriculum that was supportive of that. And so you can even take a scope and sequence from a different program that's less than ideal and take that concept and think about how you're building those practice opportunities in and providing more support, more practice opportunities in small group. It does take a little bit more work, but it's definitely possible. And she was seeing some good results with her students, even using a curriculum that was less than ideal.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too, we have great core phonics programs, but no program is perfect. And we have to really look to see what our students' reading behaviors are and what they're telling us that they need and look at their data. I love that you shared your data and you could really hone in on what are the skills that my students are secure in and where are they really needing that additional practice. And even with a strong phonics program in place, you do have to just be cognizant of your students and what their data is telling you and what you're seeing within your lessons, outside of your lessons, in your small group routines. And even with a strong phonics program, you might have to pull in some additional practice opportunities from some of these outside sources. I love it. Yeah, the Reading League does have a really nice kind of menu of decodable text to pull, different ones that are fabulous I think all decodable texts are not created equal. I think, I certainly have my favorite for kindergarten students. I prefer certain ones for second graders more than I do other grades. So I think, as you get experience and have the opportunity to look at them and dig into them, I think you do start to develop some preference for decodable text for certain grade levels. I was working in my last job with students in kindergarten through third, and I didn't use the same decodable text that I used with my kindergartners as I did with my second and third graders.
Someone had a question about recommendations for a whole group decodable reading, or do they just recommend decodable routines in a small group setting? Decodable texts are definitely not just for small groups. I always start with my decodable passage as a whole group. I might model the reading first, and then we would do a choral reading. Sometimes I would read a sentence and the students repeat that back in an echo reading. And like I mentioned before, while I can give quite a bit of feedback with choral readings, just by listening and hearing those errors and giving those corrections to the whole class, the small group setting just makes it a little more easier to give more specific feedback to individual students. But decodable texts are definitely both for whole group and small groups.
Sorry, I didn't have my camera on the whole time I was gabbing. That's such a great question. I've seen teachers do a lot of great things with decodable text, like you mentioned, whole group and small group, assigning decodable text for partner reading if students are ready to work with a peer. And choosing a peer to work with can be really motivating for students. I've seen teachers be really successful having decodable text at a center for students to practice with. So I think it's not a one size fits all. I think depending on the routines that you set up in your classroom in general can lend themselves to the different things that you can do with decodable text. Okay, well, I think, okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you again both so much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to be here and spend some time with educators across the country. Thanks so much for having us today, Larissa.
Yeah. No, thank you both for lending your time, your expertise, and your experiences. And Stephanie, thank you for sharing your students with us. They're so lucky to have you.
Thank
That's
you.
right.
And thanks everyone for joining today.
Right. Thank you guys. Stay warm.